is seasoning without salt, so looking at other ways to flavor our food. Our agenda here, we're going to talk a little bit about salt, what it is, what it does for our food, why we use it. Talk about taste in and of itself, like how we taste food, and what senses are involved in the whole process. Then we're going to talk about some herbs and spices as the replacement for salt. Look at some other things like acids, aromatics, and some other ideas. I actually think you guys are probably doing a lot of these on your own and don't even realize it. That you're flavoring food with other, you're finding a way to make your chicken taste more like chicken with things that aren't chicken. And some of, I also have a list of some potential health benefits of select herbs and spices. I always think of that as sort of a benefit. The real goal is cutting back on that sodium for our health, but and increasing the flavors. But in the process, you're still potentially introducing some phytochemicals and other antioxidants and such that can help just boost that overall nutrient density and improve your health. So about salt. What is salt? Salt is really, we typically think sodium chloride is what we talk about with table salt. But there's also potassium chloride, so if you ever see that new salt, that's what that is. But really it's anything that dissociates in water. Anything that's polar. And just the chemical reactions with our food can kind of enhance taste. There are food scientists that have evaluated turkey or chicken brines when using a combination of sodium chloride with potassium chloride, like half and half, and found that they had fairly equivalent flavor profiles at the end. So it's really, but they couldn't do it with just potassium chloride, it just didn't taste right. It tasted different. So that sodium piece is a part of it, and that's the part we worry about. We tend to get too much of it in our diet. So that's what we talk about with table salt is sodium chloride, but I think there's probably traditionally harvested salts that have a combination of other things, like other minerals involved. So the sodium is generally the problem. But salt to scientists can mean a whole bunch of different things. But for us, we're going to talk about table salt, the sodium chloride.
Which is different from like sea salt?
Sea salt is mostly sodium chloride, but that will have other minerals likely in it from the ocean. Just was floating around when they got the sea salt that day. Yeah.
There's so much out there, like the Himalayan pink sea salt, that's what I usually use.
Yep.
And the different things. Do you have anything to say about those?
They're still going to be primarily sodium. It's sodium chloride, just chemically. My guess, though, there will be additional minerals involved. The thing is, there's also a lot of these minerals in fruits and vegetables. So if you're looking for a way to add these minerals to your diet, more salt isn't going to be the best approach. It's going to be a varied diet with lots of the fruits and vegetables. Some of the minerals, too, that come into those things are found in certain seafood. And even some meats have vitamins and minerals that we need daily. We often think of fruits and vegetables, but B12 is primarily found in meat. And zinc is like, the best source of zinc, I think, is clams. So you want to get that varied diet to make sure you get the whole spread of these vitamins and minerals. But while they're fun to cook with these other salts, and I wouldn't discourage you from trying to add them, it's not like adding a multivitamin to your food, if that makes sense. So salt, we have a long history of using it. We use it in preparing foods, adding flavor to foods, preserving foods. I think that was the primary first use for salt, is that you could salt meats and they would keep. So when the hunter parts of our individual tribes would go out and bring something home, they could make the meat last longer. We naturally crave it. Just like deer and salt licks, humans have a natural craving for salt, because we do require a small amount of it in our diets. So for our health, we need 500 milligrams of sodium, but we should max out at between 1,500 and 2,300 milligrams. So, depending upon, if you're told you need to keep the salt down, that 1,500 is that's probably ideal for about everybody. But that's usually the cap that a doctor will set for somebody if they need to reduce their sodium.
So what is that equivalent to?
So, I believe it's like a quarter of a teaspoon all day. It's very small.
The 1,500, okay.
So if you think it's 1.5 grams. And that's of sodium though. So sodium's only part of the sodium chloride equation. But I think that's what it does kind of come back to. But if you think of it's less than 2 grams of the 1,500. And a gram is about the weight of a paperclip. So that's,
Is that a lot of salt?
it's not a lot of salt. The thing that makes it really hard is it's present in so many foods that we buy. Like go home tonight, look at your bread. Look at your tortillas in particular. That's the one that's always surprises me with how much salt's in it. But they did some research about, I think there was a report about 7 years ago, where they found the source of the majority of sodium in American diets was bread, because of the preservative quality of it, to keep it shelf stable. So we naturally crave it, and like I was saying, it's widely available in processed and prepared foods. It does enhance existing flavors in a dish, so chefs use it a lot, because it's a just quick go-to to bring out more flavors. And we will talk about an alternative that we can use that's probably already in your cabinet. And the final thing about salt, I think, is it's easy to eat too much. So why reduce salt? Like why do we have a cap on that sodium? So while I said earlier sodium is necessary to our health, most of us eat far too much. And over time, this excess sodium intake can lead to health problems, heart disease, kidney disease. It's even been associated with osteoporosis and certain forms of cancer. So that said, this is the case for some people and not others. Like other people, I'm sure we all know somebody who eats a terrible, salty, processed diet and seems perfectly fine and well into as they age. But this can be, these excess sodium intake has been associated with these conditions, and I try to keep it in check. It's not worth the risk to me. And the other reason to reduce salt is incorporating some other flavors can increase the variety and nutrient density of our food. So I want to talk about taste and how other senses come into play when it comes to how we eat and how we respond to flavor, I guess. We use all of our senses to eat. We often say you eat with your eyes first, so your food should look nice. Smell is very clearly a part of it. Like you can smell, you walk into someone's house and they're making cookies, it smells amazing. There's a feel, so there's texture. We respond to texture of foods on our tongues. I'm sure there's probably no one in this room that hasn't maybe spat something out because I just couldn't handle the way the texture was. Or taste, obviously, the way we taste different components of the food on our tongue. And even sound. I often talk about this. Chili's makes a fortune from 3 ounces of meat because it sizzles on the way to your table. So every one of our senses is involved in how we eat. But when we're talking about salt, you can't really smell it. So it's really just the taste on your tongue that you see. You can even kind of dissolve into our food, so it's not like you see it. But when it comes to other flavors that we're going to consider incorporating into our food, you will smell them. Like I don't think you could just know how to describe the flavor of basil, but you know the smell. So it's those smells, those aromatic compounds are a big component of how we taste food. There's only 5 senses of flavor on our tongue. But I think the way because of how we smell food, it gets more complex than that. So that smell is what adds to the complexity of how we respond to flavor. So those tastes that we can sense are sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. So sweet, I think, is obvious. That's on the tip of our tongue. That alerts us to, basically there's sugar, there's glucose on the way. Sour lets us know that certain vitamins are there. It's a good indicator for vitamin C. Salt, we crave salt. We want salt. It's, naturally, it's actually not as easy to come by as like berries, for example. So it would have been harder for our ancestors to actually have enough salt in their diet. Bitter, children have a very strong bitter sense in on their tongue because it does indicate that something is bad for us, is potentially toxic, or going to make us sick. So kids, that's kind of the reason why we learn to like things like broccoli and Brussels sprouts as we get older, because that sense kind of diminishes. And umami is kind of the newest one. I think they've decided to add it to the list in the 90s. It's describes the tongue response to the presence of something called glutamate, which basically is your tongue's way of telling the rest of the body, meat is coming, protein's on the way. And I wrote, and sometimes heat, because technically when we get spicy foods on our mouths, like chilies, that is more of a feel response, but I think it's hard for our brains to really tell the difference. It just burns. You might like that burn a little bit, might burn you less or more than whoever you're eating with, but it's that feeling, that burning, and sometimes we I want that in our food, we like that, so. It's great for covering up flavors, which is why it's very prominent in parts of the world where it's hard to keep things cold. So very hot tropical climates where it's humid, they cook with a lot of chilies, because that would basically cover up the fact that things are starting to get rancid. Not that things are rancid there now, but that's where the tradition would stem from. So we're going to start looking at herbs and spices. First, herbs. What are herbs? Now, these are the leaves of plants that lack like a woody stem. So I think, you can imagine them. They're the ones you see in the grocery store. Your thyme, basil, rosemary, marjoram, oregano. They're always in that little fresh herb section. Parsley, chives. These, you can buy them dried or fresh, too. So they even have now pre-made pastes with herbs in them and freeze-dried herbs, which kind of hold their flavor a bit better. So those I haven't worked with those a lot, but I know people that swear by them. So typically the leafy green part of the herb is used in cooking. Some of them you can get away with a little bit of the stem in there and no one's going to notice. And the plants have always been used for their flavor and sometimes their medicinal value. So spices. Spices are the dried roots, stems, and seeds of plants that are usually grown in the tropics. These are also used to add flavor to foods. The herb is what you see typically on the plant, what you notice, the leaves and things like that. The spices can be roots, stems, or bark, I should say, as well. And seeds, the stuff that you don't really kind of think about as much. So what's the difference between the two? Spices and herbs are both from plants and are used in very small amounts to flavor food. Spice refers to seasonings that are made from seeds or bark. Herb, this is basically what I just said. Herb refers to the leaves and fleshy parts of the plants that can be used for seasonings or even tea or as medicines. So spices and herbs, we can use them as flavoring agents, enhance the flavors of our food. They offer a variety of health benefits and can actually add color. So I think really great examples for how these things can add color are like turmeric, that orangey yellow color. It'll stain your counters. It's the flavor can have that kind of kind of mustiness to it, but that color really, I think, enhances dishes. It just makes everything look richer and more vibrant. Paprika is another one. I don't know if anybody else is just in the habit of sprinkling paprika on the top of everything just to give it that bright red. Yeah, it's not uncommon to do. So, yeah. So using some of these herbs and spices that will help us lower the sodium content of our food, can increase the variety and enjoyment of our food, and they also contain something called phytonutrients, which is a very new area that we're kind of learning about with nutrition. I think there's a lot more known about it than when I first learned about phytonutrients, but nutrition's this growing science where we're learning new pieces about what we're eating and what we get from our food all the time, and phytonutrients fit into that sort of role. So I have more information on that. I just kind of wanted to take a step back and talk about how this variety and enjoyment piece. I think that some of these make a lot of sense. Like the addition of a little sprinkle of cinnamon in your coffee can really make your weekend seem a little bit more special, your mornings. The adding a little bit of basil to jarred sauce makes it seem fresher and something that you put more effort into. So you don't need to necessarily be chopping and going crazy with all of the herbs and spices, but a lot of times you could add that little bit of cinnamon to your coffee and use less sugar. You could add that little bit of basil to your sauce and not require as much salt. Add a sprig of thyme to your soup or a bay leaf, and you get so much more flavor out of that you're not adding more salt or some other kind of salty thing like the Worcestershire sauce or soy sauce, something along those lines. So they can add, they can really brighten up flavors and just sort of add more interest to our food. So on phytonutrients, so phyto kind of equals plant, so plant-based nutrients. These are found in grains, fruits, vegetables, tea, chocolate, wine, and herbs and spices. So as we start to learn about sort of why people who eat a lot of this particular food or this particular drink or cultures that drink a lot of tea might have better health outcomes in a certain area, it's starting to come back to these phytonutrients. They offer antioxidant properties, so they can promote eye health, boost our immune systems, protect our cardiovascular system, and more. There's also anti-cancer properties of some of these things. The details are still kind of being figured out of what we need of different phytonutrients and how much and what they do. But it's an exciting area of research that we're learning more about, and I think it just gives us more reason to eat a varied diet where we get all of these things, all the herbs as well as the fruits and vegetables. Obviously you can get them fresh and cut them with a sharp knife. A serrated knife is going to turn everything black when it comes to chopping up your herbs. You don't want to bruise them along the way, you want to really just slice them through. Sometimes it's actually easier to use your cooking shears and cut right over the bowl you're going to be putting your food into. I personally like to cut herbs with scissors because I don't have to get a cutting board out. Just kind of stick them right over the whatever I'm eating, go right over the bowl. You can also, so obviously you could do fresh or dried. Sometimes with dried herbs you need to kind of crush them up to release the flavors. So it doesn't require a lot of work, for example. I mean, maybe if you're using something like that's the whole seed, like whole seeds of cumin or fennel, you might want to use a special grinder for it or a mortar and pestle. But something like rosemary and thyme, just rubbing it in your hand a little bit before you put that in will help release some of the oils. And often with dried herbs, it's best to have them rehydrate a little bit, so you want them to kind of cook in like a liquid, or at least tossed in the oil before you roast something, or something that's going to be a bit more moist. So that's why they can be incorporated into like dry rub or seasoning on top of a roast, because the meat's going to release juices as it cooks, and that'll soften the herbs and help release their flavors. So this kind of piece of information is listed here twice in one way or another. General rule of thumb, though, when it comes to swapping out switching between dried and fresh herbs is that if your recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of dried herbs, you're going to want to use 3 teaspoons, which is actually a tablespoon. So basically, it requires 3 times the amount of fresh herbs as it does dried herbs when cooking. So, it's a pretty easy one to remember, especially since you could just swap from teaspoons to tablespoons if you're working out like that. So storage. A lot of herbs can be, you kind of want to treat them like flowers. You know, trim the stems, stick them in some cold water. Basil can sit on your counter. It actually doesn't like to be cold in your fridge. That's what turns it black a lot of time. But other herbs you're going to want to, you can put them in a jar with some water, with the stems trimmed, and put them in your fridge. You can actually even get the basil to form roots and plant extra outside if you wanted to. For dried herbs, you just want to keep them in a cool, dark place, like a dark cupboard. You don't need like a root cellar. They don't need to go into your fridge. And you just want to keep the lids tight. And they generally have a best by date now. If your herbs do not have a best by date, you should throw them away. They're not going to add much to your food, your herbs and spices. They started requiring this, I want to say, in 2003. So if your herbs and spices at home don't have a best by date, then they're at least 16 years old. So might be time to let them go. It's not going to hurt you, most likely. It's just that they're just not going to add much flavor to your food. All right. So the other area I wanted to look at was, I lumped this all together even though they're vastly different things, other than just herbs and spices, which do a great job flavoring our foods. And we're going to talk about some select ones and some of their potential health benefits at the end. There are other things we can add. And I have acid, aromatics, and more. So more was kind of just a bunch of different things. And like I said, I think some of these you're probably going to have already had the idea at home. So acid and salt use a very similar mechanism on your tongue when it comes to how flavors are perceived. And so it can actually be a really good replacement or addition to bring out the same sort of flavors in food the way salt does. So think of like salt and vinegar chips. Like when they go together, that salt makes that vinegar, that vinegar makes that salt that much more powerful. And that kind of tingly kind of response on your tongue, the vinegar and salt, you know, they're both doing that. It's just compounded by being together. So a lot of food manufacturers will use vinegar as a replacement for salt in things. I know that there isn't one around here, but if you are in Portland and find yourself at a Trader Joe's, look at the backs of all of their low salt items. You'll see distilled vinegar in there, because it does just give that kind of enhancement of flavors. It also can act as a preservative the same way. So definitely worth considering adding some considering acid before salt when you want to flavor a dish, because it can really brighten up flavors too, particularly in a rich or bland dish. So if it's just some things like lacking in your first thought is, oh, maybe if I just add salt, it'll add some flavor. You might be able to add a little acid of some kind, maybe some citrus or a fancy vinegar. There's all kinds of possibilities. So yeah, I have the list here: vinegars, citrus, fermented foods. So that's another one to consider. So a lot of things that are fermented have acid in them. So some acids to try. Vinegar, it's fancier than you think. You could buy sherry vinegar. Well, you know, everyone probably has balsamic vinegar at home, which I think is a really great one to kind of start throwing into things. It adds a ton of flavor. If you don't like the dark color, that's going to ruin your dish. They have like balsamic chips, so you're not even going to know it's there. Champagne vinegar. I've seen everything. So I don't think there's anything wrong with just kind of keeping some of these on hand to kind of have fun with and see if that's going to work in your dish. It's good for like stews or anything that's been braised for a while too to sort of finish with. Like a little sprinkle of a sherry vinegar at the end or something like that can really just sort of add a little punch. Citrus. I think these are pretty obvious, but lemons, limes, oranges, grapefruit, those are probably the first ones people are going to think of. But you could have fun with it if you wanted to try out some citrus in the exotic fruit section. I can see why not. Fermented foods. So this would be like yogurt, sauerkraut, kimchi. Those are actually very acidic. Kefir. They're very acidic foods. They add a ton of flavor. Now, kimchi and sauerkraut are going to have salt in them. They're going to be a high salt food. But they're also very strongly flavored foods. So it's sort of a dabble do. You just keep it, you maybe don't dig into the whole bowl of kimchi, as delicious as you might find it to be. But, a little bit mixed into a soup or on top of, mixed into a stir fry adds a ton of flavor. And a lot of that flavor comes from the acid. Yogurt, kefir are great for marinades because of the acid, so you can add other flavors in and they'll help with getting that into the food. So if you think of tandoori chicken, that's always marinated in yogurt. And they also have that great tang too if you wanted to use them in dressings and stuff. Aromatics. Aromatics are basically vegetables that add and enhance flavors in a dish. There are all kinds of these cultural kind of creative combinations. The mirepoix is probably the most frequently used, and we kind of forget that it's this sort of French thing, aromatic combo of carrots, celery, and onions. Sofrito has a variety of actual iterations to it. So there's like Spanish sofrito and Italian sofrito and types of sofritos that they use in Latin America. They're usually going to include a little bit of garlic, tomatoes, peppers, things like that. The Holy Trinity, that is celery, peppers, and onions, and it always makes me think of Emeril Lagasse, because he talked about it in all of his cooking shows, putting the Holy Trinity into his different foods. So it's sort of a New Orleans aromatic combination. So these, and there's also aromatic foods that we also typically associate with Asian cuisine. So ginger, scallions, lemongrass, onions, just the kind of these flavors that sort of come together and kind of create their own distinct combinations. So some aromatics to try, and these are ones that you probably already have on hand, but onions, garlic, ginger, carrots, celery, peppers. But, like I said, you could add other things to this. It's basically flavorful vegetables that impart their flavors on foods. Can you guys even imagine starting soup without celery, carrots, and onions at this point? Yeah, you're already doing this. You could just beef it up and add a little bit more if you wanted, and maybe reduce some of the salt. So there's also many other ways to flavor food with little or no salt. One of those is the cooking technique itself. So the grill is a great example because you get that char and that flavor, the smoke. Braising things tend to allow the flavors already in the dish more time to come together and concentrate. Roasting's another great one. Roasting concentrates sugars and makes them easier for us to detect, which adds flavor to dishes. Time, so kind of this adds on to the braising thing, that kind of low and slow. Not only for texture, but does allow the flavors to spend more time together and really marinate, or marinating, again. You can probably do a lot of marinades with far less salt if you've got the vinegar and seasoning kind of components in there to penetrate the meat. Or you could try some things unexpected, like coffee, tea, chocolate. There's lots of spice rubs that have these kinds of flavors in there. You can do, I've had tea poached chicken before, I think. So there's people are, there's recipes out there that use these other kind of flavors that we might not think of. I think the other one that I did put on here that we already do is like wine and beer. We pour that into cook our food with to add flavor there. There's not gonna be a lot of salt with that. Not to say that these are a healthy thing to be adding to our food. We're typically going to cook off a good chunk of the alcohol, but not all of it, so. Maybe not for a kid's birthday party. Okay. So, I mean, those are really kind of summarized the different ways we can flavor our food without salt. But I did want to take a look at some of the more potential health benefits of using some of these items, some of the herbs and spices. So the first one we'll look at is oregano. So oregano has some antibacterial properties. It has phytonutrients, which we talked about, to help fight infections such as staph or staphylococcus. It's loaded with antioxidants that help prevent cell damage. An excellent source of fiber, vitamin K, manganese, iron, vitamin E, tryptophan, and calcium. Now fiber, you're probably gonna have to eat a lot of oregano to get the fiber that it talks about, but you know, it's every little bit helps. Kind of thing. Rosemary, I want you guys to look at the backs of different frozen meats. They nearly always have rosemary extract in them. And my guess is it's less for flavor and more for potential. It aiding in, probably has flavor, yes, that rosemary extract's there for that, but I think there's also preservative components to it, the reason why food manufacturers would use that. So the aroma from rosemary may improve concentration, performance, speed, and accuracy, and to a lesser extent mood. I recently did a food demo where I put a rosemary tree next to my food, and it boosted my day, standing there. I liked it. In Europe, rosemary is often used to treat indigestion. May also be good for your brain. With an ingredient called carnosic acid, it can help fight free radical damage in the brain. Also a rich source of antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds, which are thought to help boost the immune system and improve blood circulation. So those are all potential benefits for rosemary. Thyme may reduce coughing and bronchitis, upper respiratory infections and colds, acts as a food preservative. Early research may also shows that it may have benefits regarding high blood pressure, breast cancer, and colon cancer. So I mean, really these are plants. And I think that's sort of the summary, is just getting more plants in our diet that haven't been adulterated in some way. They're just fresh, and even if they're dried, I guess. You know, that's all that's been done to them. They've just removed the water. So it's just an act of getting more plants into our diet can potentially have these health benefits aside from reducing the sodium.
So there's no health benefit to have fresh versus dry?
I think a lot of the antioxidant things we talk about here are probably going to be a bit more concentrated in a fresh, because they'll need water. That said, I don't think it's gonna, it's not gonna be a huge difference. And like you know, you're really just adding more variety and more plants to your diet. They do sell to, other than the freeze-dried varieties, there's also frozen little cubes you can buy of different herbs. Like I've seen the garlic and ginger ones are like really convenient, but they also have them with like basil. And you can also preserve them frozen yourself, like oil or in ice cube trays if you wanted. That would help keep that fresh, preserve it a little bit better. But I think some things too, it's just easy to reach into a cupboard and sprinkle some thyme into a dish than try to remember, did I get it at the store? Or when did I get it at the store? Is it still going to be good? So, now cumin you'll only find dried. Contains cuminaldehyde, may prevent or treat diabetes. So supplementation with cumin potentially as effective as this says OHA, which is oral hypoglycemic agents. So that's like metformin in the treatment of diabetes. So this is according to the Journal of Pharmacological Research. And it can protect our bones. So basically, there's some potential to with cumin in terms of our blood sugar, our bones. Cuminaldehyde is really going to be have these potential benefits. You might start to see it as ingredients in medicines. Not sure how quickly that will be happening or if at all, but it's clearly something that people are looking into. Now, cumin, you can buy it as the seed or ground. I think most of us probably have it ground in our cupboards, but if you do buy it as the seed, it's going to last longer. The flavors will last longer. And you can cook with it still. It just, I mean, it doesn't look like much in the jar, but once it gets cooked into a little bit of oil, like you can really smell it. And that's kind of the basis for a lot of Indian and Middle Eastern cooking. Like I think you probably don't recognize that's what you're smelling when you, but you know, toasting up those spices when they look like this. I have a recipe where I start with whole seeds of cumin, just cooked it in a little bit of oil, toast it up, and the smell is amazing. So turmeric, I think we're seeing a lot of people talking about turmeric for its health benefits. In general, I think people lean on the fact that it's rich in antioxidants and anti-inflammatory. There's lots of potential with turmeric, and there's lots of different recipes for using it. So we'll start at the beginning. It contains curcumin, a compound that is very rich in antioxidants and can protect a number of organs and systems in our body. Potential for more than 50 healing actions, from relieving pain to improving circulation. It's an anti-inflammatory, has anti-cancer properties. There's been more than 1,000 studies. So there's lots of research in this. Even, help with chronic inflammation that are associated with modern diseases. So that would be type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cardiovascular disease. So those are things where turmeric may have a potential benefit in preventing these. A lot of these actions too that are talked about with turmeric are enhanced by combining it with other foods. So when we talk about these kind of cultural diets and parts of the world where they seem to live longer or have lower rates of such and such a disease, oftentimes we focus in on one particular ingredient and forget that, or one even component of an ingredient, and forget that there is a synergistic quality to the way we eat and our foods. So turmeric has a great example of that, in that a lot of the potential benefits of turmeric are enhanced by adding black pepper or cinnamon. So that's, I think it's just more reason to put these things in your food instead of going and buying a curcumin supplement, which you can find. You could buy turmeric and flavor your food with cinnamon. You could try making golden milk or making a curry. So the next one up is cinnamon. I know in my line of work I see a lot of people turning to cinnamon for help because it has, it's associated with better insulin sensitivity. So people use it with type 2 diabetes, or even just to see if they, because what they're doing is they're just not producing as much insulin, or the insulin's, they're not sensitive to it anymore. So being able to better sense that in the body, if cinnamon can help with that, can maybe reduce the type of amount of medication they need, or that's how they see this. I say go ahead and add cinnamon to your diet. This is a potential benefit. It's not going to be a replacement for your metformin, but like I said earlier, that cinnamon on your coffee, you might be using less sugar, which is also great for type 2 diabetics. Cinnamon also may prevent cancer, hypertension, help with wound healing, and high cholesterol. Has food preservation components with microbes, or fighting microbes that can preserve food, help hold off bacteria. It's combating H. pylori. It's been effective with that. So H. pylori is what causes ulcers. A lot of times people thought it was a rich diet or a diet in a lot of acidic foods, but it's actually a bacteria that they can test for and treat with antibiotics. So that's how most ulcers are treated now. Chili peppers. So they will increase our metabolism. And I think we just have a response to the spice in our bodies. We sweat a little bit, kind of perks everything up. You're sort of more alert. They've been used as painkillers. So if you think of like capsaicin creams, that's what we're talking about with peppers is capsaicin. So that's the heat response, everything. It may improve cholesterol, can prevent cancer. Again, good for stomach, can kill H. pylori. So you wouldn't think adding chili peppers to your diet with an ulcer, and I probably wouldn't jump to recommending it because it probably will irritate you. Because when you have an ulcer, there's an irritation there. The H. pylori is already gone far enough to cause the irritation. If you happen to have H. pylori and no symptoms, then it's probably nothing's really become that irritated yet. That could be a potential time, but you're probably just not going to know it. So again, this is one of those times where adding a new flavor to your diet can make things a bit interesting. And I will say too, with chili peppers, they're not all fiery heat. If you're not, I know that New England is not really known for its spicy cuisine. It's not what we do. There's a lot of butter and seafood and potatoes and cheese. So, kind of bring some things from other, doesn't even need to be international cultures, but even parts of our own country, adding some flavors. The chili peppers are definitely something that people enjoy over the rest of the U.S., just not as much up here. And there's all different kinds. So one starter chili that's not really spicy at all, I think, is like a poblano. You'll often see, they can come dried or fresh. So a fresh poblano is dark green. It's really great in chili because it's kind of got the heat sometimes. Some poblanos are spicier than others. Or some poblanos are a little bit spicy and some are very not spicy at all, just like a bell pepper. So, if you buy two, chances are one of them is going to give you a little heat to your dish. But they're great in chili. They've got a kind of grassy flavor, so they add a lot of freshness to it too. And you can also buy them dried as an ancho chili. You'll see ancho chili powder. Those are dried, crushed poblanos. Another one's are chipotles. Chipotles have enough of that smoke to add a different interest for people. So that's a good one to incorporate with. And if you buy it in dried powder, then you aren't getting any salt from a canned poblano. A canned chipotle. There's another one I was thinking of. Forgot. Oh, smoked paprika. You could buy smoked hot or sweet paprika. So if you want to add more heat, you could go for the hot paprika. But it's the smoke that you're getting that's what adds interest. It makes everything taste like barbecue potato chips. So that's it for the different types of foods and things we can incorporate to replace our salt. Any questions? I know I covered a lot, and I feel like there are parts that maybe you guys might be interested in more detail with. So black pepper, really, I probably should have given that a little bit more time, but it is a spice. There's no salt in it. It's often considered the king spice because it's used in everything, everywhere. It goes with salt, but there's no reason why you can't just start with the black pepper. See if that adds to your dish. It's got a little heat. My mom thinks it's too spicy, but that's how I grew up. I also like the little black flecks on food. I personally like that. Any other questions? Anything? I guys thought they started doing that when people were getting such bad goiters because they just didn't have enough iodine in their diet. It was like people in the Midwest who didn't have as much access to seafood. But if you're drinking milk, if you're eating seafood, you don't necessarily need to have iodized salt to prevent a goiter. It's not as much of an issue anymore. But most of the salt we see now is iodized. The only time it's ever a problem is if you're undergoing radiation treatment. So Frito has so many different iterations that I didn't try to remember them. But there's also, there's blends of these spices, these aromatics for every cultural cooking practice. I mean, or even blends of spices. Think different, particularly with like Indian cuisine, there's all these different spice blends, or Asian cuisine. So there's 5-spice powder, so there's Chinese 5-spice powder. There's also Vietnamese 5-spice powder. There's Japanese 7-spice powder. So there's all these blends and these combinations that people have worked out over millennia, you know, to add to food. So I've had Chinese 5-spice powder ice cream. That was really good. Sounds weird, but it was really, really good. So yeah, I think that in the end, really adding these different flavors to your food, you're not just, yeah, it's a way to replace the salt and reduce those risks for hypertension and other cardiovascular disease and stop putting stress on our vasculature. But it also has the potential to bring health benefits to us. So a lot of the research in these last few slides is new, is young, we're still figuring out the details, but they can't hurt. So go ahead and try something new, give it a shot.
Biggest thing I see, don't be afraid to experiment.
Yeah.
Just try stuff.
And I would say try those before you go to the salt shaker. You know, and a lot of times too, you don't need to add, so I think there's kind of like 2 times to add salt to a dish. When you first add ingredients and they're kind of cooking and kind of bringing things out, you know, start with a little bit to kind of help it in that process. And then right before you serve it, if you've tried out, you know, taste your food, see, okay, does it need this or that, or does it, the only thing that makes sense is salt, then that's a good time to potentially add some salt. But maybe you could try a splash of vinegar or a pinch of onion powder or paprika or, you know, even just some like fresh chives or scallions over the top can just brighten things up. I got into an argument with a roommate once when I told her she needed to add lime to her soup. She's like, but I don't want it to taste like lime. And it's like, you just need to brighten up this dish. It's just like, it needs something.